Hi, folks. Thanks, everyone, so much for joining us. We'll get started in just a moment. As we get this webinar underway, we'll just ask that you please keep your microphone on mute until the discussion portion later on. If you run into any technical difficulties during the conversation, please feel free to send a private message to Ashley Davison, who's our event manager. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be available to anyone who registered along with the materials. So please keep an eye out for that after today's discussion. With that, we're so grateful you're all here, and we'll jump in and get started.
Hi, I'm Gigi Weisenfeld, a senior ECE policy specialist at the National Institute for Early Education Research, NIEER, housed at Rutgers University. NIEER's mission is to improve the learning and development of young children by producing and communicating knowledge that transforms policy and practice. We collaborate with a network of local, state, national, and international leaders to design, conduct, and disseminate rigorous research, evaluation, and policy analysis. One of the projects I oversee is CityHealth. Since 2017, NIEER has been evaluating both the access and quality of city pre-K efforts as part of the CityHealth project. And I don't know, Ashley, if you'd like to go to the next slide. Actually, probably even the next one. Not that there's much to see, but I'll give you some info what our logos are. To support this work, we have provided technical assistance, created policy briefs, and developed peer learning experiences for city leaders. With the generous support of CityHealth, I am pleased to introduce today's host, Emmy Liss.
Thanks so much, Gigi. Good afternoon again, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. My name is Emmy Liss, and I'll be co-hosting today's session with my colleague, Josh Wallach. Josh and I currently lead a virtual learning community of cities, counties, and other local leaders who are focused on implementation of early care and education programs. This year, we are supporting teams in 18 cities and counties, many of whom are represented here today, as they expand access and focus on implementing with equity. We both previously worked at the New York City Department of Education and helped lead New York City's pre-K for all expansion, ultimately building a program that served over 100,000 children from birth to 5. Before we dive into our panelists and today's discussion, I'll give a bit of context for what brought us here today. If we jump to the next slide. The idea for today's webinar really started with a policy brief that was published by NIEER that Josh and I co-authored along with Gigi and Ellen Freedy, also at NIEER, titled Components to Consider When Planning City Preschool Programs. Over the past several years, we've seen a growing number of cities and counties deepen their investment in early care and education, which has been really exciting for those of us focused on these issues. This paper focuses specifically on preschool programs for 3- and 4-year-olds, though we see an increasing investment across the full spectrum from birth to 5. And I know folks who are speaking today will represent programs that serve a range of different ages across that spectrum. It's been really inspiring to see this much local investment and action, especially in the absence of a big new federal push on early care and education. And as more and more local leaders work on similar topics, we know there's incredible learning that folks can do from each other. Often we find ourselves in silos trying to solve the exact same problems. And so this paper and the discussions that we're hoping to generate around it aim to summarize some of the top considerations that have come up across a range of different places so that folks in other cities, counties, and municipal governments have a bit of a guide as they think about their own planning. And so we know folks joining us today, many of you have really strong birth to 5 programs you're already operating. We'd love to hear about that as we get into the discussion. We also know many of you are just starting out on your journey, and we hope that this can provide a bit of a framework. In the brief, we focused on 9 major components for planning and decision-making, which you'll see listed here on the slide. And so within the paper, what we tried to do is provide examples from different places around the country of how folks have tackled each of these elements, recognizing that there's no one right answer. And often the decisions that leaders need to make are based on local context, local governance, and other considerations. And so this, again, can provide a bit of a roadmap, depending on what some of your opportunities and constraints might be for how you could think about planning as well. Some key takeaways from the policy brief, which are captured in brief on the next slide. Again, just investment in innovation at a local level is growing, which is really exciting. And I think something we don't want to let go of the pressure that I think many of us hope to continue to apply to the federal government to see greater investment in early care and education. But in the meantime, do see great inspiration coming from what's happening locally. And again, there's no one right way to design programs, but we think there are many different examples that folks can learn from as they go. So in a short little bit, we'll welcome our panel of city and county leaders who will speak to how they thought about planning for their local preschool initiative, including some of the components I just mentioned. And the leaders who are joining us today represent programs that are in different stages of maturity. Some are in earlier days of planning. For others, implementation is well underway. For today's conversation, we wanted to take a step back from these 9 components and to talk more broadly about the overall planning process and how each of these program leaders approached that process, including who they brought to the table, how they worked through some of the design decisions highlighted in the article, and how they built the necessary coalitions for success. We hope that this will turn a potentially abstract topic into something really concrete and provide a potential framework for other local leaders as they think about how to get started or how to move forward with their own planning. So with that, I will hand it over to Josh, who will introduce our panelists.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with all of you. Today's panel includes some incredible leaders from around the country that are going to bring some really valuable insights and reflections about their experience planning for early care and education programs. I'm just going to say folks' names, and if they could just say a quick hello, so you can put names to faces as I introduce them, that would be super. First, we have Brooke Chilton Timmons, who's a management analyst with the Multnomah County Department of Human Services Preschool and Early Learning Division.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today.
Rebecca Noecker, who's a council member from St. Paul, Minnesota, representing Ward 2.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here.
Kristin Spanos, the CEO of First 5 Alameda County in California.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you.
And 2 representatives from Detroit, Denise Smith, the implementation manager from Hope Starts Here, Detroit.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And Camarrah Morgan, currently program partner at the Max M. and Marjorie S. Fisher Foundation, but previously led the community engagement for the Hope Starts Here project.
Hi, everybody.
As we hear from the panelists today, just a reminder, please remain on mute and share any questions or comments you may have in the chat. We'll have about 15 minutes, we hope, after the panel for Q&A. And we'll select a few key questions that we get there that bubble up, and we'll try to gather some from the audience if we have time as well. We're going to start with each panelist sharing a little bit about their city or county's initiative and planning process, and each will speak for about 5 minutes. So we'll hear first from Brooke.
Thank you, Josh. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Brooke Chilton Timmons. I use she, her pronouns. Preschool for All connects families with free, inclusive, and culturally responsive preschool in Multnomah County, Oregon. We're in our first year of implementation with 36 different providers and 718 slots. We will grow each year until there's publicly funded, there's universal access to publicly funded preschool in 2030. So at full implementation, we expect to have between 11,000 and 12,000 slots. We only have 2 eligibility criteria for our program. Children must be 3 or 4 years old by September 1st of the preschool year and have a parent or legal guardian living in Multnomah County. The program was created with a passage of a ballot measure in November of 2020 and received overwhelming support from the community, with 64% of the community saying yes. And the measure does not have a sunset provision. Our work is paid for by the highest income earners who live or work in Multnomah County. Approximately 8% of our tax returns from county residents will include the Preschool for All tax, so fairly small group. And during the fiscal year 2022, the tax raised $187 million. Oh, I think we're already on the next slide. So this slide, oh, sorry, go back one. The Preschool for All task force process started in 2018, and it included almost 100 people who created the vision and foundation for our work. So the task force included community leaders from early childhood, school districts, business, philanthropy, culturally specific organizations, housing, and healthcare. It was co-chaired by then Multnomah County Commissioner Jessica Vega-Peterson. The task force was supported by 4 different work groups made up of technical experts in policy and program, workforce, infrastructure, and finance and administration. And so the work of the task force started with a commitment to racial equity and the idea that every family should have access to a preschool that was right for their child and should be able to afford it. We started with a blank page beyond that when it came to the actual policies. And we called this process community-based participatory policymaking. So we worked to make each of the groups representatives of different types of organizations, for each of the groups to be racially and ethnically diverse, and for organizations that work closely with children, families, childcare providers, and culturally specific communities to be well represented on each of the work groups. All of the recommendations that were approved by the task force came directly from the work groups by people who knew each of these policy areas deeply. The task force met for 9 months, and each meeting would focus on giving task force members important context about different issues, like preschool teacher compensation and professional development, and then bring forward recommendations from the relevant work group about how those issues could potentially be addressed. What was, I think, most exciting about this process was that there was also a Parent Accountability Council, or PAC, that was central to our work. So every recommendation that was brought to the task force was also brought to the PAC at the same time. And so their involvement that ensured that these early decisions were informed by the real experiences of parents. We also included 2 of the parent leaders who were part of the PAC on the task force itself. And so the task force and Parent Accountability Council discussed every single recommendation and sent feedback to the relevant work group. Those recommendations were then revised and brought back to the task force and to the PAC for a vote at a future meeting. And in July 2019, we published a report from the Preschool for All task force with 50 recommendations that created a framework for universal preschool access in Multnomah County. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we might have jumped ahead. There we go. So these are some of those key policies that became part of the Preschool for All plan. And I think there are a few key things that helped us arrive here. So the first was flexibility. We did not start with a specific election goal, timeline, tax mechanism, or budget. We started with a set of values and worked through each big policy area to create a vision for Preschool for All. We valued community expertise and experience as highly as research or best practices. So when a parent on the Preschool for All task force said that a 6-hour school year preschool day wasn't going to work for her or her community, the planning was broadened to include a full 10-hour year-round preschool day. We also learned from other communities and brought those lessons into our planning. So for example, we knew that other jurisdictions had lost infant and toddler care when they expanded preschool access, and we didn't want to repeat that in Multnomah County. And then finally, time. Although the work of the task force ended in 2019, we continued planning with the community for another full year before the ballot measure was voted on. And then we didn't, so we had those 2 full years for community planning, and then our first slots didn't begin until September of 2022, so that we had enough time to put our foundational structures and staff into place. And I think my time is up.
Thank you for that incredibly thoughtful summary of a really inclusive process. I'll hand it over to Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Josh. And I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be part of this collaboration, this group, when I was thinking back that when we started this process about 7 years ago, we felt completely alone in this work. And I still remember the day when I finally felt discovered by the Children's Funding Project. They said, we've heard about St. Paul. And I thought, oh my God, we're not alone. There's others out there. So just being part of this conversation feels great. And I also want to point out, as was said earlier, we are 7 years in, and I would say we're still in what I'd call the early stage. So to those of you out there who, like I did, just listen to Brooke and we're like, oh God, we want to be there. It can take a while. And I think the early, medium, and advanced timelines differ depending on the city and your situation. But here in St. Paul, we've been working on this, as I mentioned, for about 7 years. I'm the originator of the project. The idea came to me when I was on a study visit in Akron, Ohio, of all places. And we started talking about Washington, D.C.'s universal pre-K effort, and also the way that city had committed to just being a great city to raise kids, everything from making stroller accessible bus loading zones to universal pre-K and everything in between. And at the time, I had a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old of my own. I'd been recently elected to my first term on the city council. I'd previously been a middle school science teacher. And I saw the connections between city government and education and family support, and thought, wouldn't it be cool if we did something like that in St. Paul? So we initiated the planning process in 2018. And I would say from the beginning, we've been really cognizant of the need for this to be a very big tent, to have as many stakeholders as possible involved. Just the idea of the city stepping forward into early learning here in Minnesota, no other cities have done that. No other counties have done that. So we were very much a first. And just changing people's mindsets to believe that a city could actually step into this space was a huge lift and continues to be. So bringing as many parties to the table from the beginning and using as many established partners as possible that already existed was key. So the St. Paul Children's Collaborative, which is a group of the Ramsey County officials, we're part of Ramsey County, the city of St. Paul, and St. Paul Public Schools, as well as community stakeholders, started this work with creating a blueprint in 2018. This was a very high-level document. It involved many of the same stakeholders that Brooke mentioned: parents, providers, nonprofit leaders, elected officials, city staff, to talk about what a program in the city of St. Paul might look like. And some of the things that we landed on really early on as guiding principles were that this needed to be a mixed delivery system. So we did not want to create our own childcare centers. We wanted to take full advantage of and frankly support the existing ecosystem of providers that we had. So we knew it had to be mixed delivery. We also knew we did not want to have it all entirely located in St. Paul Public Schools, a universal pre-K model, because we knew the effect that would have on small providers, and taking out all the 3- and 4-year-olds who are kind of their bread and butter, putting them in the public schools was not going to be viable. We really had an eye towards small providers, including small providers who may not be part of our state's quality rating system. So I think we're one of the few cities that is currently considering a model that doesn't require providers initially to be part of the quality rating system, because that would eliminate about half of our providers at the get-go. So the idea was really to create a big inclusive tent, support providers to improving quality over time, but not to be so exclusive at the very beginning that we never got them in the door. And then finally, parent choice was something that emerged very early on as key. We know parents have different schedules, different cultural and linguistic preferences and backgrounds, and we wanted to make sure that whether it was a 2-day Somali language down the street neighborhood provider or a kinder care center or St. Paul Public Schools, that families were included in this. So the blueprint came out in 2018 with some of those very high levels. Oh, sorry, still back. I'll move quickly now. There you go, thanks. And was presented to the city council, and the city council basically said, great, keep up the good work and take this forward. So we convened a design team then, which was a much more in-depth group with some of the same stakeholders from the blueprint, but the idea was to get from those high-level guiding principles to much more concrete ideas of what this program would actually be. And that design team involved a major community engagement component. So 200 families, about 75 providers were talked to develop these in-depth recommendations as to how you would actually run this program. In 2022, we launched an effort called Spark, St. Paul Ready for Kindergarten, which was essentially the organizing arm behind this. So all of this work had been happening at the city level, but we knew we needed a big community organizing effort as well, in part because we decided that the way to fund this program would be through a special levy, an increase to our property taxes over time, which would require getting on the ballot and then getting a majority vote in the fall. We ran a petition drive last summer to get on the ballot. We got more signatures than any effort in the city of St. Paul or Ramsey County has ever received. And unfortunately, due to a miscommunication between our city and our county, which I won't get into here, we were told that the number of petitions we'd submitted was not valid. So the other way to get on the ballot is to have the city council vote to put the issue on the ballot. But unfortunately, by the time we found out our signature drive was insufficient, it was really too late to garner that kind of buy-in to put it on the ballot last year. Instead, we created a city council early learning legislative advisory committee, which was tasked with basically making all of the recommendations that had happened to date, bringing together a new group with some of the more political stakeholders, our teachers union, some advocacy groups, as well as parents and providers, and take all of those recommendations and make them more concrete and formal. The city council hadn't yet authorized an official committee to do this work. It had all been happening kind of in the community. And so this work group met for 6 months, took a lot of the recommendations that had already been created, added some new ones. The basic program design continues to be mixed delivery, focused on the lowest income students. It got expanded to 0 to 5 from 3 to 4 because people really felt that need from birth. And those recommendations were actually presented to the city council last night. So we are right in the middle right now of figuring out what exactly we need to do next. And I see Josh's hand, so I will stop there, but we're very much in the early stages.
Thank you. That's really exciting, and we'll hear more about that in the next round of questions. I think it's really interesting the way your process kicked off with some of the questions with strong assumptions about some of the answers to the questions, like mixed delivery and your approach to the QRIS, which is fascinating. I'm going to hand it over now to Kristin to take us through the next presentation.
Sure, great, thank you, Rebecca and Brooke. I really appreciated hearing from both of you, and I echo just my appreciation for this group. It is interesting because, like, as you're in the silo of doing the local work, it can feel a little lonely, and so I've really appreciated being able to be on these national calls and, quite frankly, be learning and being the recipient of the information. So appreciative of the time here today as well. So we are not Hope Starts Here. We're Alameda County. And for those who might not be familiar with Alameda County, we are located, Berkeley and Oakland are 2 cities in our county, and I serve as the CEO for Alameda County First 5, of which we're a county-wide agency. And you can see we've been trying to refine kind of how we define our work, because it is quite layered and quite complex, and we have a system building approach to early childhood. First 5, there's a First 5 in every county in Alameda County. It was passed a voter initiative in 1998, funded through tobacco tax. And we've had the good fortune of the success of tobacco tax, and that less people are smoking, but that means less money for early childhood in California. And so I joined the organization 7 years ago, and there's been a real intentional push both to lift up and think about how we resource early childhood within the county. And also, as we do that, how we think about not just sustaining, but scaling, and how we build an equity-centered early childhood system. So our North Star is that every child is ready for kindergarten. When we did our recent kindergarten readiness study, 37% of children enter kindergarten ready within Alameda County. And that's been a pretty persistent, that's down from 44% of that in the study that took place in 2019. And we recognize that early childhood educational experience is part of that, but we all know that it's not the only lever and support that families and children need. And so hence the system approach. And so we do investments in administration and family-centered parent partnership programming. We have some place-based investments that we do. There's 4 neighborhoods in our county that we invest in deeply. And we have deep work with our managed care plan and other health partners who are doing work related in the pediatric offices in connection to resources for families and kids. And as I indicated, both recognizing, given the racial disparities that face our country and certainly face Alameda County, focusing, having an equity focus, and also recognizing basic needs and the socioeconomic underpinnings, again, of supporting kindergarten readiness. So when you go to the next slide, in Alameda County, we've had the good fortune of having actually 2 ballot initiatives. And one for the city of Oakland, that was a parcel tax that was run in 2018. 31% of the funding would go to supporting college-bound and students and supports. 62% would go to early care and education, of which we are the contracted early implementation partner. So this ballot measure was voted in 2018. It immediately faced litigation. And this past year, the courts had resolved the issue. And so we are literally in the process of contract negotiation with the city of Oakland now to finalize the implementation of that. The first call on that money is with Oakland Unified and Oakland Head Start, and we are negotiating when they reach capacity, and then any remaining funding would go out into the mixed delivery system. And it's a 30-year ballot measure. The other, which there was a measure that was run in 2018, it lost by like 1,200 votes because you needed a 2/3 majority. And then the community went back out and put forward Measure C. That's a 0.5% sales tax that would generate roughly $150 million annually. And we are, First 5 Alameda County is the named administrator in that. That currently is in litigation. The Superior Court ruled in July in favor of the voters, and it faces opposition in the appellate court, and we anticipate a ruling within the next 6 months. For the next slide, so there's really been multi-year planning that has been underway within First 5 Alameda County. And just to give you a sense, we would go from an organization, we started the year at 20 million. Our budget is now up to 50 million with the administration of the local Oakland money, and that we could surpass over 200 million by the end of the fiscal year. But it's been a 5-year kind of planning, and there's been ongoing kind of very intentional planning in relationship to all of the components that are listed on the left-hand side: financial modeling, hiring of human resource staff who have worked in complex, large public systems. There's been communication, storytelling, and materials related to early care and education. There's been investment in technology, eligibility, and enrollment systems. There's been a lot of kind of looking at the legal aspects related to the implementation of this work. In addition to really kind of cross-sector engagement, working closely with stakeholders, community members, the ECE sector, ensuring like as we build out that we're doing it in representation of what community and what the ECE sector identify as their needs, including parents. And then, as I indicated at the beginning, it was the notion of having this money being administered by the one independent governmental entity in the county that has expertise in 0 to 5, and that in doing that, you allow early care and education to be scaled, but you also afford an opportunity as you bring in blended funding for other elements of an early childhood system to be invested in more deeply. So that being the community-based investments that I talked about, as well as the family partnership and health and well-being. And all of those have been very intentional around evolving them to be more participatory and directed by community and the ECE sector and parents.
Thank you.
I'll stop and
no, thank you very much. It's a sort of a speed round, but also very again, like another example of a process that that had to go through. You know, in one case we saw a sort of a ballot initiative and then a city council process. This and again ballot initiatives that shape a planning process, and these systems interact with one another, and something I think that we don't talk about enough. And I'm going to turn now to Denise and Camarrah to talk about another really intentional and thoughtful process undertaken by Hope Starts here in Detroit. So I'll turn it over to them.
Awesome, thank you. Also happy to be here and to co-present with Camarrah. I'm going to talk really quickly so I can hand off to her. Hope Starts here is a connector of early childhood efforts across Detroit to ensure a comprehensive, responsive, and sustained early childhood ecosystem for children birth to 8 and their families. And this was really inspired, the catalyst was back in 2016 when the magnitude of unmet need for children of Detroit, 1 out of every 3 couldn't access formal care, demanded this sense of urgency and required some deep collaboration. And so the community was engaged in kitchen table listening sessions, which Camarrah will tell you more about, to get us towards a framework. Slide 2, please. We set a vision that by 2027, Detroit will be a city that puts young children and their families first, and that certainly will begin to decrease that original 30,000 seat gap in early childhood programs. Today, we're currently at 22,000. And so in 2017, all the information that came from the engagement process informed the framework, and we landed on the model to implement using a distributed leadership or coordinated collective impact to implement these 6 imperatives, 15 strategies, and 26 policy priorities, which we distill annually. At that time also, W.K. Kellogg and Kresge Foundations announced a $50 million investment to make sure we could advance that framework. In 2018, we began to lay the foundation for the implementation. So I brought in my colleague who's also on the phone, Jeremiah White, and others, started having those conversations with him to come and support. But more importantly, we activated Imperative 2, which Camarrah will tell you about, was that parent and caregiver leadership and activism. And we aligned with other efforts that were happening in the city. So the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, our Early Childhood Advocacy Network, and also the Office of Early Learning, which is located at the City of Detroit. Slide 3, please. And then finally, in 2019, we began deep implementation of this framework that you see exemplified in these 6 imperatives. We use results-based accountability to monitor, track, and inform our progress towards equitable access, quality, and affordability of early childhood services for Detroit children and their families, so that by 2021, we began truly establishing Hope Starts here as a resource and creating feedback loops to ensure ongoing community and partner engagement. By then, we had also onboarded all 6 imperatives, or these community-based organizations that in turn enlisted others in creating and normalizing our tactics and narratives of action, which we are situating within the guardrails of data, research, policy, and practice. The emphasis on these elements and the capital that we've earned has afforded Hope Starts here and its partners the opportunity to influence local and state policy and practice, which currently includes how the state of Michigan will implement its universal pre-K option, which the Governor Whitmer has proposed and put forth some money in her budget. Key and cross-cutting to the collective work of Hope Starts here is Imperative 2, Detroit Champions for Hope. And so with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague and friend, Camarrah.
Thanks, Denise. Let's see what's on the next slide here. So I just wanted to share quickly, let me see. As Denise talked about we can go to the next slide actually after this. This process began with a $50 million investment by Kellogg and Kresge, who also committed to this effort. So this was having a multi-stakeholder engagement, as Denise talked about, for a year-long process where we had over 280 people who participated in monthly meetings to really design the framework that Denise just described. And the city of Detroit was a part of and was included as part of that ecosystem, but did not lead it. So I think that that's an important difference because of the urgency, like Denise talked about, some of the childcare gaps, but also poverty rates, infant mortality, as well as maternal mortality and third grade reading levels, our system needed to be comprehensive. While it includes preschool, it also is really more a comprehensive system of 0 to 8. So there was 1 to 2 years of pre-work that took place. So there was an ecosystem map, which is what this is identifying 216 partners and organizations that were serving children and families. This ecosystem map was utilized in order to identify the 280 people who were participated in that year-long process, but also helps us to really have a better understanding comprehensively of what the child needs in order to really be successful. And so this work was funded by a local university for a local university to do that. Our foundations also pre-funded some technical assistance partners who helped to provide data and other supports throughout the planning process. And then it was a distributed leadership model, as mentioned, with the stewardship board that helped to provide the oversight and really deep community engagement. So the next slide is around a community engagement process. Yep, I see. I'm going to wrap this up. So we had a long process. I set my own alarm too, of working with community to be engaged to help shape all of the work that was happening every month by the 280 stakeholders, which included 80 parents. But it was also 18,000 people who contributed to that framework that Denise just developed, which really launched the community engagement effort and ongoing efforts of parent and caregiver engagement. Because so many people were engaged, they continue to be engaged during implementation. I'll stop there.
Thank you all. I'm going to just reflect for a moment to say that I think what we saw were 4 examples of really thoughtful processes and different processes. And it sort of underscores the point that Emmy made in the beginning, that there's sort of no right way to go about this. It depends on the particular sort of institutional and political context of the place. But all of you focused on bringing the right people to the table to make a set of decisions, for the programs and children and families that they serve. The next question that I want to ask each of you is, in the context of these larger processes, when you had to make sort of the highest stakes decisions, some of the more difficult decisions, how you thought about who needed to be around the table at those moments, and particularly whose input you wanted, and whose consent or support you would need in order to move the project forward. And sometimes those are the same people, and sometimes they're different people. And maybe you can just, you can reflect a little bit on that question for us. So I'll start, we'll go back through the group again, if that's okay. And maybe Brooke, I'll ask you to kick us off.
Sure. I mean, I think for us, we really wanted those policy groups to be representative of, I think I mentioned, who's working closely with children and families, who knows this part of the work really deeply. And so those were really deep policy folks and people who'd never been included in processes like this. We made sure that family child care providers participated, as well as system partners. And then the task force, we made a little bit broader, because we knew that even though housing leaders weren't, leading preschool efforts, those things are connected, and families' well-being overall is connected. So we tried to think both big picture in terms of who knows about this, who's going to help us think broadly about how this impacts the community, but then also as we think about Black and Brown families in our community, linguistically specific communities, how are we really reaching a wide range of families with low incomes? How are we getting input from organizations or from people themselves that are working closely with children and families and childcare providers as we built a mixed delivery system model?
Thank you. That's great. Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you. You referred to it a little bit in your previous answer, so it'd be good to go a little more in depth.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I would say that, apart from really feeling that parents and providers needed to be in the process from the beginning and that their voices were central, we didn't really worry, and we haven't really worried too much about whether or not a particular group had the authority to make decisions. We've known that we've been building the bike completely from scratch, not even as we're riding it. We're not even riding it yet. and from the beginning. And so it felt important always to have parents and providers. It felt important to have representatives from the different local governing agencies and from childcare advocacy groups who really knew the details of these programs. But we really felt very empowered, I think, from the beginning in each of these different groups we brought together to make decisions that then, as long as they were inclusive, were accepted by the next group. The one thing that I will say is that we've learned that there seems to be a trade-off. I'm sure many other groups have experienced this too, between the big tent and making detailed decisions, right? Like the higher you stay, the longer you stay in the high level of accessible childcare for all and a city that cares for kids, it's very easy to keep a broad coalition together. It's once you start to get into the very specifics of, well, how do we define quality? Who really is eligible? Those sorts of decisions can tend to split that big tent apart. And so I think to our credit, we've tried to stay high level for as long as possible to try to build that coalition and keep people together and build commitment to the idea before getting into decisions that would potentially break up that coalition even before it had a chance to get started.
Thanks, Kristin.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I also just want to call out Detroit Hope 6. It's like I've been hearing about it for a while, and it was really good to see the visual and hear the presentation. And I completely appreciate the collective impact framework and the intentionality around community input. And so I'm saying that just my answer is going to be the intention is to get there here, and we're in the process of building it. But initially, when Alameda County was thinking about a ballot initiative, because it was county derived, the first stop, quite frankly, was advocating as to why First Five should be the administrating body, and to make the case of we're an independent governmental entity, so we have a level of flexibility that doesn't exist in the bigger systems, and we have the expertise in 0 to 5. And then by doing that, you not only get to scale ECE, but you also get a whole community, whole child approach to building, an early childhood system. And then as the money is coming in, it's then the intentionality of doing kind of what Detroit, articulated in a very surgical, intentional way to make sure that the system itself is equity centered and that those processes and design reflect that.
Thank you. Denise, Camarrah?
Yeah, so I will answer from two lenses, and then I want Camarrah to jump in, and I'll start with this kind of our steering committee and the imperative leads. It is really important to us, and always has been, that we do center justice in the work that we do. So it was always in our minds, for the partners that I also asked to come alongside me, that nothing was done for or to people without them. And so in that same vein, we wanted to make sure that the stewardship board was cross-sector leaders, that we had representation of all those factors that could influence a child's life, particularly the Hope Stars Here ecosystem, from health to local government to foundations, parents, providers, and more. And in selecting those imperative leads, it was very important to me to think about folks who had some experience or expertise in that specific lane. As example, for health and wellness, well-being of families and children, we chose our health systems and Henry Ford Health Department. And likewise, folks who had some level of expertise who could lead and also bring together other members in the community, other partners, to excel on that particular imperative. And so Camarrah, if you could go a little bit more deeply into community leaders.
Yeah, and I'm just going to be really quickly. So when we developed the model around even the community engagement, it was really child-centered. So it was those who were closest to the child who needed to be in the process. We literally create like a profile map of like who all is interacting with the child and making sure they're there. But when we took a look at the ecosystem map, Detroit is comprised of a ton of organizations that are actually have the trust of our families to be able to deliver the services. So the ecosystem map was really essential, because who is going to help us move the work forward after we make all these decisions? these organizational partners. So they had to be at the table helping us make the decisions so that they could lead the work forward, which is why our distributed leadership model of the imperatives leading action teams that continue to function and continue to engage community, and they make the decisions based on those priorities in that area and are able to help to align to the funding that's needed to get the work done. So I will stop there. I hope that was 30 seconds.
Yeah, if I could just add one more note. So what we don't want is to design without folks being able to influence and impact that design, and that we're always checking in. So it is a continuous improvement process that we use our data to inform and guide. So as backbone, Jeremiah and I really are supporting those imperative leads and doing the work that Camarrah just relayed.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question that I'll just open to anyone who wants to answer. I won't call on each of you. And I'll also encourage those who are listening in, now's a good moment to put your own question in the chat, because after this, we'll open it up. We'll have time to open it up to questions from others. You know, when planning a big initiative like this, oftentimes leaders have to set priorities on what to focus on first and what can wait till later. And you know, hindsight's often 20/20. So for us, for example, in New York City, we did not initially address disparities in teacher compensation between our community-based organizations and our district schools. That was something that we waited until later to address. And though we made strides to do that later on, it didn't come as soon as it should have. And looking back, I wish we had made that a higher priority sooner, if not initially. And it's been really inspiring, by the way, to work with groups that have put that into the planning from the very start, like several of you. So to help others benefit from the lessons that we're all learning as we go, would any of you have an example of a topic that you wish you had addressed earlier in your planning process that, you know, looking back, it didn't come up until later, but boy, would it have been better if you had raised it a little bit earlier? Does anybody have one of those that they want to suggest people jump on faster?
I definitely do. So I actually have three. One was family leader compensation. So I'm sorry, I'm babysitting also because my friend needs to go to work. It doesn't have childcare. So that's why we're here, right? So anyhow, our family leaders, we developed role descriptions and we wanted family leaders to be engaged so that they could engage families in the community, but we didn't put in infrastructure for compensating them. And our organizational partners would not refer families until we did. So we had transportation and childcare, but not compensation. So that's important. We also we developed a community engagement planning team that was comprised of organizations that typically do engagement with families and caregivers in the community. But we designed the engagement roadmap before we engaged that planning team. So it was based on research on you need to do surveys and you need to do focus groups and town halls and all these other things. And the community engagement planning team said, nope, our community is exhausted with surveys. We don't trust people who come into our community, want to take out data. We're not going to invite them to a town hall. So we had to redirect all of that process. And it would have been helpful to just engage those folks in the beginning and have them create the community engagement planning team. And then I would also say, during our multi-stakeholder meetings, we engaged a lot of center-based programs and Head Start and free preschool, things like that. But our home-based providers, the times of the meetings did not allow for them to be able to attend. And so they showed up in droves when we did we had like a launch of the framework, and then we did some community conversations around what does the community think about this. And so our Saturday session was full of home-based providers who said, you didn't host any of these meetings at a time when we could come because we don't have substitutes, and our priorities are not reflected here. So those would be my three recommendations.
Thank you.
I don't have a specific example, but I think one thing that helped us was staging out some of the planning. So we had the big vision 100 people sitting around the table stage. We took folks from that process and we encouraged them to stay involved in a planning process. And then we went to a deeper dive to Rebecca, some of the things you mentioned about like, okay, it's great to have a ban on suspensions and expulsions, but what do we actually need to put in place in order to make that policy successful? And so that helped us move into more of the implementation piece. And then meanwhile, behind the scenes, we also had an internal process at the county to say, what would it mean if Multnomah County becomes the administrator for this program, which wasn't a given at the beginning. And so that process really got into procurement details and classifications of jobs and all the things that we had a box around. So it didn't make sense to, as long as we were following that broad community vision and the guidelines for that was the right group to make some of those decisions. So I think also thinking about who's helping you make some of those more detailed decisions is helpful.
I would also throw in there, this is not a program design question. And I think it's the kind of thing that might seem like it's, it should come after you've done a lot of program design. But I actually think that trying to figure out what funding source is most likely earlier on is very smart. I think we started thinking, well, we need to design the whole program so we'll know how much money we'll need, so we'll know which source can meet that need. But I think you can just safely assume you're going to need a ton of money. A lot of money. So, and it's going to need to be public and it's going to need to be sustainable. So at least in Minnesota, cities are actually really limited in terms of the dollars that we can raise without legislative approval. We can't do income taxes, for example. We can't really do, sin taxes, et cetera. And even our sales taxes require legislative approval. So we're basically left with a property tax. And so figuring out what that source is will then help you figure out earlier on what kind of coalition you need to build, what kind of legislative strategy you're going to need, how much political organizing you're going to need to do.
Thank you. Super helpful. Other thoughts on this question? If not, I'm going to hand it over back to Emmy to moderate some of the questions. And again, if anyone who's listening in wants to pop in the chat or just raise their hand, go ahead. Emmy.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Josh. I'll start with the questions we've seen so far, but yes, please do feel free to drop other questions in, or if you'd like to raise your hand, we'll pay attention there as well. So the first question I'm seeing here is from Cindy Staros, who asked, in your community building efforts, did the business community play a role in supporting expansion initiatives, and did you reach out to engage them?
Well, I can jump in and say individual business leaders have been very involved and supportive. That said, there are a number of large business associations that actually are part of coalitions that advocate for investment in early learning and have done so for years. And so those natural allies, which we would have thought would have been very supportive of a city effort to support early learning, were much more reticent than we would have thought. They really wanted to focus on change at the state level, which is where historically funding for early childhood has come from, but also historically where it consistently fails to come from at levels that are sufficient to meet the need. And so there was this surprising pushback to the idea of actually taking action at the local level rather than continuing to lobby the state fruitlessly, writing white papers, coming together at conferences and that kind of thing. And so I guess that was a little bit disappointing. And I do think it's there's partly just an anti-tax sentiment sometimes in the business community. And unfortunately, I think sometimes it is easier to bang your shoe on the table than put your money where your mouth is. But I hope that's just the case here.
I will just jump in really quickly. So for Detroit, we have always had business partners at the table as part of the multi-stakeholder engagement table. And we have a business partner on the stewardship board as well. And then when we did the community engagement efforts to develop the framework, we actually had a lot of small businesses who feel like they're typically overlooked, and they wanted to be deeply engaged. And they've been totally supportive and really innovative partners, including like grocery stores that put up reading signs around the grocery store to help make the experience interactive for young children. So that's been very refreshing.
And if I can add, in addition to that, and capitalizing on it became more obvious, impact of COVID on our economy, our society, we determined that it was an opportune moment to bring to the awareness of big corporations, larger businesses, the impact of not having early childhood programs, because at the height of COVID, that 30,000 that I talked about in the beginning, it exacerbated to 44,000 seats that didn't exist. And because of that, we had women leaving the workforce. We had others who were not going back to work later on during the pandemic, and businesses wondering, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And so we seized on that opportunity to run a campaign, focus and targeted to them to say you need to create family-friendly work environments. Perhaps you need to think about how you support seats in the community and more. And so that is a campaign that we ran, and we're looking to re-enliven very soon here as well.
And just quickly, we did include, I think most importantly, our chamber leaders in our task force process. And I think that early involvement meant that later when the campaign happened, they were neutral about a tax that primarily impacted higher wage earners in our community. And so I think that was really important. And there was a lot of behind the scenes work done to keep that engagement and keep the business community at least neutral in our work.
Yeah, I was going to say in Alameda County in the campaign work that there was that I wasn't involved in. I think that there was partnership in relationship to like health. Kaiser is where its home base is here in Salesforce. Its home base is in San Francisco, and so I know that there was like, you know, outreach and partnership on that. And I think on the campaign, I hadn't been involved, but I will say and echo during COVID, I think it's lifted up just how central and foundational early childhood and childcare is. And so there's been, I would say, renewed interest in thinking about how the system is built out and is serving, you know, the community and workers in the community. And so there's a workforce task force that we've helped to establish, and the Economic Development Alliance on the East Bay is really interested. And I think that there's, again, a recognition of how important it is.
Thanks all. Seeing some really tactical questions, could you all speak, or whoever would like to speak a little bit to the type of staff or roles that you used and needed in the planning process, and how some of your initial planning work was funded? I know a few of you have mentioned in particular private funders who stepped up, but if there are any other streams you look to support the planning work in particular.
I'm happy to start here. I was actually going to add it when Josh asked his other question about what would have happened earlier. And here, I think I would hoped for a realization that the staffing structure and even the structure of the effort would have been realized earlier, that it wasn't going to necessarily hold up the work that we were putting forth. And by that, what I mean is there are a lot of nonprofits. It was the desire of our funding partners not to create another nonprofit, to create competition, which we totally get, but we had to be something, right, in order to receive funding, in order to make sure that the work was supported in a good way. And then initially there was just me. And I was like, it can't be just me. We need other people, particularly somebody to focus on data, which is why I brought in Jeremiah to look at and think through data needs and how we actually monitor and track the work that we're doing, but also wanted somebody to think about every day as well. What is the research and what are the policy implications of the work that we're doing? And so that was the core staff. But even now we see that capacity is needed, even beyond that. And certainly, what is the governance structure to make sure that that work can be supported, but also is not stymied in any way because of of the different and competing objectives that that governance body may have. So what is the initial structure that you need? Is it going to be, is the capacity for it enough to support the initiative? And what are the exact goals that we're trying to agree upon? So all of that work, I think, aligns to the staff that you will need to carry your effort forward. And if you can think about it or come to agreement about what that is earlier as opposed to later, I think it doesn't allow that backtrack that or step back that might be necessary, which we went through. But still trying to advance the work at the same time.
I mean, we're hiring like crazy because we're in the middle of a ramp up, and it's really been at all levels of the organization, including the infrastructure pieces that Denise just spoke of with regard to data, but really finance, compliance, you know, quality, you know, coaches, provider engagement. It's really been a holistic. The only thing that I would add is that there's been a sense of like, what might we contract out, and when it's more appropriate to, you know, it's like, are we at a place where you would want it as a full-time employee, or is there other entities that are positioned better to be doing the work? There's some discernment that we're trying to apply to the structure and holding of the work.
Thanks, Kristin. Sorry, Brooke, did you want to jump in?
The only thing I would add is, so one of our county commissioners was the champion of our work. So we had a small amount of money that she was able to convince her colleagues to support her kind of in these planning efforts. But then our planning team included, you know, local nonprofit, our early learning hub that was funded by the state. So that made up our planning group. So we were able to kind of bring together small bits of resources to do that work as a team.
Great, thanks. Thanks everyone who's dropping questions in the chat. We're noting them all down and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. So I'm going to combine a few of them, and then anything we don't get to, we'll just quickly address at the end to make sure we've tied up all the threads. There's been a couple questions in the chat about family child care homes and how they've been included in your initiatives. Could you all, or whoever's interested, speak a little bit to what the funding looks like for family child care in your initiative, in terms of whether that's comes through the same sources or is differently funded? And then what kind of interest, participation, and engagement you've seen?
Our funding source is the same for family child care, so it is mixed delivery. We have high participation from family child care. So we have 47 different locations, 24 in this first year, 24 of them are family child care. And we have built in multiple supports to ensure their participation, including an intermediary organization that's actually doing the subcontracting to family child care providers and small centers, because we know that a government contract is a barrier to authentic participation in our system.
So the city of Oakland funding, which is the ballot money that has wound its way through litigation, and we're in the finalizing the contract. The first call on the money is the Oakland School District and Oakland Head Start, because the city runs a Head Start program. And if there's any remaining, that goes out to the mixed delivery, of which that would include centers and family childcare. On the county side, that 0.5% sales tax, that will be mixed delivery, and that will also include family childcare and centers. And we currently provide coaching and TA to both centers and family childcare providers, as well as engagement with family, friend, and neighbor.
Great, thank you both. Another question I'm seeing in the chat Brooke, you spoke about this a little bit in your remarks, but either if you'd like to expand or if anyone else would like to speak to this, what sort of strategies have you all pursued to ensure that infant toddler sector wasn't hurt by the expansion of pre-K?
Yeah, quickly, we are trying to incentivize providers who participate in Preschool for All to keep their infant and toddler slots. So we're including a base payment just for having infant and toddler slots, and then we're actually paying them per slot to maintain that. And then we have specific ways they can use that money, which is primarily to raise the wages of the teachers and other staff working directly with infants and toddlers, so they can so we don't create pay inequity within one facility as they become a Preschool for All site.
I mean, it's very much on the radar and part of the conversation in Alameda. Again, the city money, the 4 priorities, and it starts with 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds. But again, it was initiated in 2018 pre-Governor Newsom's investment in California and universal pre-K. And the anticipation is that the investment in infant and toddler, the deep investment would happen with the county money, because the Oakland money is just smaller in size. And again, the order of priority puts the 3 and 4-year-olds first, but it's very much kind of front and center, because that's where we see the largest gap in terms of access and need for families.
So I'll add a couple of elements, even though we haven't landed on our UPK. What we have done is an expansion of our Great Start Readiness Program, which is for 4-year-olds. And even in that expansion, we, with our Caring for My Future, has a number of aspects, including facilities, workforce, and more. The facilities grant, though, in encouraging uptake of it in utilization to, I don't know, create a ramp or other things that your program may need. Part of what's been communicated is that, and because what's tied to that is an expansion of your capacity, what's been encouraged is that that expanded capacity is infants and toddlers. I will also add that as advocates and my participation on Think Make Babies Michigan, which is focused on 0 to 3 as part of the Pritzker initiative, we are advocating for infant toddler contracts. And we'll continue to do that. And I know that's part of the conversation that's being considered in terms of our CCDBG dollars. So looking at it in terms of a subsidy provision and how those contracts will be for infant toddlers as a beginning to hopefully bridge some of the gulf that could be created by folks letting go of infants and toddlers to do 4-year-olds because of the expansion that exists, and so that we really get to a true and better mixed delivery system. That is our optimum goal here, is to be able to support across that continuum of development and learning, and that we are ensuring that those educators in all of those providing services for all those children, especially infants and toddlers, which is our biggest gap, are compensated well.
Thanks, Denise. I know we are running quite short on time, and I want to make sure that we do wrap up on time. I think there's one question I will sort of answer because I think it provides a nice preview of the follow-up panel that we'll be having in April to this one. There was a question in the chat about who the entity is that is leading implementation in each of your locations, and whether that's a local school district or another entity. And I think in all of your cases, it's a bit of a collaborative effort that includes a couple different partners. And so when we convene a follow-up panel to this one in April, and we'll share registration information on that before we close, we'll be highlighting all different governance models from across the country and the way that different folks have thought about early care and education. I want to just turn it back to my colleagues, Josh, Gigi, if there's any other sort of closing remarks you all would want to make as we wrap things up. And for folks whose questions we didn't get to in the chat, I apologize, we couldn't answer them all, but hope that you'll follow up with us, though there's some information on the final slide about how to stay in touch after this webinar.
Thanks, Emmy. I'll just do a quick, because I know we have like 1 minute left. So here's the information about registering, and I'll put it in the chat, I think. Or maybe in a minute, because I can't multitask well. So let's go to the next slide. So we hope you can join us. And I want to thank all of our panelists today. Here are some resources that we have worked on at NIEER, as well as other ones that we have been part of that may be helpful to you. Oh, I just noticed that it says AMP weird. So ignore that part of it. But they may be helpful in kind of addressing some of the things like building political will, thinking about true partnerships, all the kinds of things we've tried to address, as well as funding. So please take a look at these, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. But thank you all so much for all of your time, both the panelists as well as Josh and Emmy and Ashley for helping us in just kind of putting all this together. Here's all of our contact information. Feel free to reach out to all of us, and we will send you a copy of the slide deck as well as a recording in case you'd like to share with others who were unable to join us today. Thank you all, and we hope to see you next month.
Thanks, Gigi. Thanks, everyone. Huge thank you to our panelists and to all of you for joining us today.